Começa agora o programa 20 Minutos com Breno Altman.
Bom dia! Está começando mais uma edição do programa 20 Minutos Internacional. Nossa convidada é a norte-americana Jodi Dean, professora, escritora e militante política dos Estados Unidos. Formada em História pela Universidade de Princeton, doutorada pela Universidade de Colômbia, atualmente leciona no Departamento de Ciências Políticas do Robert and William Smith Colleges, em Geneva, estado de Nova York. Autora de 13 livros, o mais recente desses acaba de ser publicado no Brasil pela editora Boitempo. Camarada, um ensaio sobre pertencimento político. Antes de começar a entrevista, gostaria de pedir que façam uma assinatura solidária de Opera Mundi em nosso site ou se tornem membros pagantes de nosso canal no YouTube. A imprensa independente precisa da sua ajuda para se sustentar e se desenvolver. Também peço que curtam e compartilhem esse vídeo, além de ativarem o sininho do canal. São ações que ampliam nossa audiência e nossa receita publicitária. Como essa entrevista foi previamente gravada, infelizmente não poderemos repassar as perguntas de nossos internautas. Good morning, Professor Jodi Dean. Thank you for accepting our invitation. It's an honor, this opportunity to interview you on the 20 Minutes International Show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Professor, I would like to start our conversation with a question regarding a previous work written by yourself. Is the communist origin still valid, or was it buried with the Soviet Union collapse?
Thanks for that question. So first, the communist horizon is still there. It's the line that gives us a sense, it's the line between where we have and where we could be. And it's a line that orients us in the present. So rather than thinking about the horizon as just this perpetually displaced future that we never reach, I think we need to think about the very idea of a horizon more spatially. Like whenever we're, say, outside, we get our bearings by looking onto the horizon, seeing like, okay, what's the dividing line between Earth and space? Where can I see the end of where I am and what's beyond? Like, how does that line orient us? So if we take that spatial metaphor into politics, then we really need something that says, guess what? We are not doomed to be stuck in this neoliberalism, this rule of, essentially, forms of fascists and exploiters for the rest of our lives. There is something else. And when we focus on the communist horizon, we have the sense that, yes, we can organize it and be elsewhere. So, all the critics of communism aside, the horizon is not gone. It is still there, and it continues to orient us.
Is there not a contradiction that is difficult to overcome when affirming as a political origins the paradigms that were implemented by a defeated experience?
I don't want to say that the experience was defeated. I mean, I think that the Soviet government fell apart, that it had to essentially, dissolve itself and let another kind of order come into being, does not mean that the whole of the Soviet experiment was defeated. Like, you can look at it this way. If people are in a long-term relationship and then they break up, they can still think, well, it was a good relationship. It was good while it lasted, but it didn't last forever, right? So that something ends doesn't mean that the whole of it, the experience of it, is useless. So I think we need to keep that in mind. And we also need to keep in mind that the Soviet Union is not the only experiment in communism. Of course, there's China, there's Cuba, there's Vietnam, and then there are also forms of communist, continuation that don't take the form of state government. They may not be in control of a state, but they still exert presence in society. I'm thinking of communist parties in India, for example, which are very strong, and then other kinds of movement parties elsewhere. So one setback and one defeat is not a defeat of the entire experiment.
Let's talk about it. What is your assessment of the Soviet Union experience, by the way? Why did it end the way it ended?
So if my overall assessment, as you can tell from my previous answer, isn't going to be just in terms of how it ended, right? If we think of its successes, we can think of its, the rapid economic development that was installed, that the Soviets were able to accomplish, the increase in literacy, the increase in life expectancy, the dramatic change and improvement in women's conditions, the science and technology there. It's a little bit absurd that these stupid billionaires like Jeff Bezos are all bragging for going into space for 10
Billionaires flying to the space.
Oh, yeah, it's ridiculous, right? And the Soviets did this in the early 60s. They had the first people up there, and the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova, was the first woman in space. So I think that when we start getting a larger view than just the pressures of the 1970s and 1980s, of the larger capitalist system, the Cold War, the pressure exerted by the United States and by U.S. militarism, that was hard. And the Soviet Union wasn't able to survive that. But the achievements before that, they're pretty remarkable.
But some mistakes probably have been made during this time to justify that the Soviet experience finally has fallen apart.
I think a lot of the mistakes, it's really, I think this is a hard thing to say, right? Because if we, on the one hand, do we document every country in terms of explicit mistakes where and when, and how do we sort those out? Do we look at general principles that the society held up for itself and wasn't able to achieve? For example, by its own standards of economic prosperity, in some decades it reached them, in other decades it didn't. It started to sort of stagnate, and it started to stagnate in part because of bureaucracies. But it also started to stagnate in part because of the pressure put by U.S. imperialism militarily to just try to crush the progress that they were making. So I think that in terms of trying to think in terms, we want to try to document failures. There are always going to be mistakes that can be analyzed and looked at, like, why did they do this? Why did they do that? On the other hand, the Soviet Union won World War II. Right, the Soviet Union sacrificed. They lost 20 million people in World War II. Hitler would not have been defeated had it not been for the bravery and the diligence of the Soviet military. Should they have been more prepared? Were there mistakes in advance of World War II made under Stalin? Sure, right? Those are real mistakes. But miraculously, they were able to overcome those and still, defeat the Nazis in the Second World War.
Was there a democratic problem, a democratic issue in the Soviet Union, which could be one of the reasons the Soviet Union collapsed?
The thing is, what makes it hard for me is, I think, to try to answer that question is wondering, it's like, if the United States was not putting pressure, nuclear pressure, would the situation have been the same? Or did U.S. nuclear pressure compound an already bad situation? And I don't know the answer to that. There had been quite a lot of loosening up of, basically say social restrictions on publishing, social restrictions on the kinds of things that could be said in political debate, right? That had been loosening up. Gorbachev was not the cause of that. He was a manifestation of that having already been ongoing. Was it that too frightening for the entrenched bureaucracy? Or was it too frightening for the entrenched bureaucracy because of other kinds of pressure being put on them? And was the loosening up happening in, also under other kinds of subversion and pressure from the U.S. and from the imperialist West? Those are also questions that, to have a nuanced answer, one would have to talk about.
Professor, you have gone beyond reaffirming the communist origin in your books and articles. For instance, you clearly defend the Leninist type political party as the most important instrument in the class struggle, in opposition to the horizontalist culture that prevails in many sectors in many countries in the world. Are you really convinced that this concept has not lost its utility, especially in the digital and social networks age?
Oh, thank you so much for this question. I love talking about this. So I think that the first part is in the technological reality of the digital age is not horizontal. Anytime that we are engaged with technological media, right, we go through a whole set of nested networks. There are decision makers at different parts, like the people who implement the algorithms, the people who are the bosses of the ones who implement the algorithms, the people that those bosses report to, the people who make the profits off of them. So we've not escaped from hierarchies. It's a kind of illusion that the horizontalists have that, because we have cell phones, now everything is flat and we're all like equally decision makers. It's actually the opposite. It's gotten even worse, right? More hierarchical. It's no coincidence that since in the, say 30, 40 years since we've had, I call it communicative capitalism, that we've got a higher concentration of wealth than we did in previous centuries, right? We've got greater wealth inequality, greater hierarchy than we had before. So the horizontalists, I think, first are just like their diagnosis of the present, like, everything is horizontal, so our politics should be too, is just really, really mistaken. Now, about the Leninist Party. So the Leninist Party actually reflects the composition, the economic composition and the political composition and the technological composition of the world much more than the horizontalism. Second, if you want a group of people to get a lot of things accomplished, how do you do that? Most organizations like corporations, like militaries, like political systems have hierarchies in order to get things accomplished. If you just want to hang out with flags or a bunch of posters and then talk among yourselves and drink a bottle of water and go home, then horizontalism is okay. But not if you actually have actual political goals and you want to get something accomplished.
Professor, is Leninist political theory strongly based on the class's logic, not shaken by structural changes in the world of labor, with a strong reduction of the traditional working class, for instance?
People who are really influenced by Trotsky would probably make that kind of argument and have a really approach to labor and work that sees the working class as an industrial proletariat. But, one of the things that made Lenin such a powerful thinker was his recognition that, the revolutionary people was an alliance of workers and peasants. It was never only an industrial proletariat. So the first thing is to recognize that that how Lenin understood, working class was much broader than industrial proletariat. Second, one of the things that's a kind of interesting sort of problem is that some people if you just look at the history of discussion of political parties in the last 100 years, Marx and Engels argued for a party because workers were disconnected. And yet our horizontalists say, oh no, workers are disconnected, we shouldn't have a party. It's like, wait a minute, it's not like the party rises organically from a structure, from an industrial structure. It's rather that the separation that capitalism puts on workers of all sorts has to be remedied politically through the form of voluntary organization in structures like the party.
Do not new political theories originating from feminism and anti-racism, among other sources, supported by the concept of intersectionality, call into question traditional Marxism with its classist verticality?
I'm afraid I'm going to say something that's going to be just too incorrect, but maybe I'll just do it anyway. Sure, they call the Marxist stuff into question. That's the problem, right? That's the problem with them, is in fact, in calling the Marxist stuff into question, they reflect their capitalist underpinnings and actually tell us which side they're on. So maybe that's a little bit extreme, but that is what I think. But let me make a little bit more nuanced answer. The more nuanced answer has been that for socialist and communist, race and gender, or it was called the woman question for 19th century and early 20th socialists. Those have always been central. Again, it's a distortion and a misrepresentation of the communist and socialist tradition to act as if the preoccupation was only with a specific industrial working class, right? And in fact, questions of gender, questions of structure of the family, questions on the sexual division of labor, all of those were important. I mean, my God, like the early communists as in the first part of the 20th century, they're having conferences and groups and congresses and alliances. They're doing stuff all the time to organize women. Women played a major role in the Russian Revolution. They were important in the, sort of not very long, but early German, quick German Communist Revolution in 1919. And of course, they've been, radically important in China and Cuba and elsewhere. So I think there's a way that honestly, I think it's like a critique of some stereotypes of Trotskyist parties that comes in. And also there's a kind of liberal, and neoliberal duplicity to say, oh, everything that has to do with Marxism is bad. And we liberals, we're the ones who are helping women and helping people of color, when in fact, we know that's not true.
In your book, Comrades, you dedicate to rescuing this concept, comrades, as a theory of political belonging, as if the very identity among communists had been broken the post-Soviet historical cycle. Do you believe that there was a fragmentation of ideas and values that led the communist movement to be a great mass revolutionary current during the 20th century? There was this fragmentation, and that's the reason you have written a so interesting book as Comrades to rebuild these values and ideas in a belonging theory.
Yeah, I think that the contemporary left has lost something. And we've lost a sense of what does it mean to be on the same side of a political struggle. And that this is actually crucially important, right? That for much of the 20th century left, like if we want to think about the kind of broad days of the Popular Front and the United Front, I mean, everyone might not have been in the exact same formation, but there was much more a sense of being part of the same struggle. And after the defeat of the Soviet Union and the kind of liberal / neoliberal claim that, history is over, we're at the end of history, liberal capitalism has won, that's all there is. There was a kind of fragmenting, but also dissolution of an understanding
of identity,
of the sense of what does it mean to be on the left. So it's like, I could know what it means to be an environmentalist. I can know what it means to be against, to fight against violence against women. I can know what it is to fight against race depression, but I don't know anymore what it is to be on the left. So this sense of a left, identity is sort of right, but I'd like to think about it more as political belonging, because political belonging gives you a chance for there to be different identities, but one politics, right? One sense of we know who the enemy is, and we will have each other's back in the struggle against this enemy. And I think that's what's lost, and that's what we really has to be regained or rebuilt, like you said.
What means to be in the left nowadays?
Yeah, that's the question, right? From the standpoint of the American right, like these far right, not even far, like the Republican Party is like crazies, right? So these far right people, like they think that, the mainstream of the Democratic Party is Marxist. And so the strangeness of being on the left,
that Joe Biden is a kind of Mao Zedong.
Oh, it's crazy, right? It was not surprising when they said this about Bernie, right? Bernie Sanders identified as a socialist, but freaking Joe Biden, my God. And you may remember that the right attacked Barack Obama as being a communist. There was all sorts of things like, there's a communist living in the White House. They did weird sorts of memes and pictures of Obama being, I don't know, just like on the same group with Lenin and Mao and etc. So from the standpoint of the right, essentially anybody who believes in some degree of freedom and equality is a communist, and that's all the left. The left doesn't know what it is to be on the left. The left doesn't know who's on the left. And I think that's also why the boundaries are policed. Like the left, particularly the social media left, always trashes each other, right? Constantly. They spend more time attacking one another on the left than they do on the right. So the left is very broad in general, stretching from between some sort of mainstream Democrats all the way to anarchists. But I think that that's in part because the right has gotten so fierce, so it's basically fascistic. Like they've become so awful that the line is shifted again from this mainstream perspective. Like from my perspective, that's not the left. From my perspective, left is socialist and communist.
But I have read your book before our interview. It's really a very interesting book. And I think that you tried successfully to change a negative concept about to be a leftist man or woman for a positive, changing it for a positive concept. Is it enough to be a leftist person to be against the right wing, or you need some positive values to be a leftist person? And which positive values? Revolution, socialism as in 20th century, or it's enough to be in favor of the human, of the black people and the environment? Which positive values defines a leftist person nowadays?
From my perspective, the dividing line is capitalism. And do you think that we can have capitalism with a human face? I think that anyone on the left has to say no. it is impossible, because capitalism says that the interest of private property and accumulation are the ones that should drive production. That means that something like making sure that the environment is taken care of, making sure production meets needs, making sure that people are equally engaged in work, are equally benefiting from the proceeds of labor. All of that, capitalism says, no, that's not the value, that's not what it is. And so from the capitalist standpoint, there can actually be, in my view, there can be no respect for Black people, because it will say, if we can make a profit by giving Black people cancer, by making sure that Black people don't get decent housing, by selling crappier goods to Black people, by exploiting Black athletes, and by exploiting Black celebrities, et cetera, we will. And so you actually can't have the bare minimum of kind of respect and dignity if you have capitalism. So I think the line is...
The borderline to be a leftist person, man or woman, is the anti-capitalism. That's correct.
Yeah.
In your point of view.
In my view. But then it has to be... So that's the negative statement. And then the exciting project is working out collectively and together the positive alternative, right? Historically, that's been called communism or socialism, but it is understood as a collective democratic project that we work out together. That it's an activity. It's an ongoing, collectively produced alternative, not a blueprint handed out by a theorist, even in a very cool book with a great cover.
Could the weight that you give to this theory of belonging be compared to the cohesion narrative used by sects and churches, which seek in their exceptionality in the face of crowds the reason for their existence?
Could you ask the question one more time? I'm not sure I understand it.
I was asking, the theory of belonging that you defend in your book could be compared to the narrative used by sects and churches, which seek in their exceptionality in the face of crowds the reason for their existence.
The thing with the religious conception is it's like the people are chosen by God, right? I mean, and in the political conception, they choose themselves. So that it's a really I think it's really fundamentally different there.
I understand. Professor, you are a well-known member activist of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, the PSL. This organization did not support Joe Biden's candidacy against Donald Trump, unlike the Communist Party and other left-wing organizations. Why? Because we have ran our own candidate, Gloria La Riva. And we've run Gloria La Riva before, and she is a long-term committed activist. And by running Gloria La Riva, we're able to make clear the imperialist similarities between the two mainstream parties, by the Democrats and the Republicans. I'll add that during the first part of the primaries, members of the party were allowed to, if they chose, to support Bernie Sanders. And so it's not like we were taking a view that it's impossible for the Democrats to ever select someone that we could support. We thought that Bernie Sanders, even though he was running as a candidate in an imperialist party, would make a significant difference and could make important steps towards socialism in the United States. But he was, it seemed really like
like the Democratic Party, they pulled themselves together to take the nomination from Bernie Sanders. I mean, the way that so quickly all of the other candidates withdrew and put their support behind Biden, who had been doing terribly in the early primaries, was really pretty scandalous. So our position was, we weren't supporting Biden. I will say that in the first months of the Biden campaign, we have been, we were not campaign, in the Biden presidency, we were supportive of a number of the large-scale social programs and measures that they were suggesting. I can't remember the names of them, but they had to do with different kind of like American Families Relief Act and these various things. And there were some good measures there, and we were supportive of those. Members were encouraged to participate in advocacy for those. Right now, of course, the thing that is in our immediate viewpoint is Biden's refusal to get rid of the 243 measures taken against Cuba that were enacted by Trump, which is one of the, Trump and Biden are not the same. And we never took the view that they were the same. But right now, with respect to Cuba, their policies are exactly the same.
But in general terms, what's your assessment of this first 6 months under Joe Biden administration?
I think that's hard to say because it's so difficult right now to see what's going to get passed, what kinds of legislation is going to get passed. What we can tell for sure is that the political strife in the United States is an effect of the standoff between the two mainstream parties. Right? There is no space in our two-party system for the kind of politics that we need to get rid of the sort of epidemic of gun violence, the epidemic of police violence, to deal with climate change, to in fact have a sensible or a more sensible reaction to the coronavirus, to deal with the outstanding measures of debt. The two parties are they're locked in this standoff with one another, even as their views overlap substantially. So I think that rather than sort of giving an assessment of him, what we should do is do an assessment of the standoff and how much it needs to be ended, broken up by having essentially a revolution that would let a new system come in that would that would actually reflect the people and the people's needs and the people's concerns.
Professor, do you believe that a left-wing alternative, even more with a communist origin, is possible in the greatest capitalist power on earth?
Yes, it's necessary in the greatest capitalist power on earth, right? Here we could actually do some serious damage to capitalism, right? Here we see some of its worst effects. The U.S. life expectancy has declined for 3 years in a row, right? That's the sign of a counter-modernity. That's the kind of sort of de-development that global capitalism has done in Africa and and in different countries around the world. But what the theorist Walter Rodney talks about, how Europe undeveloped Africa. We see now U.S. capitalism undeveloping the United States, which is what it's done to countries all over the world. So here, exactly because we see the problems, we absolutely can have and must have a revolutionary left presence.
Is Joe Biden a new Franklin Roosevelt? Is he able, or would he be able to recover the USA capitalism?
I like the question a lot. I'm stumbling a bit because I think that if you think about it with respect to Biden as a person and his own pragmatism, that he would try to make measures that would improve the situation. But I think given the larger, say, constellation of forces, just political forces, that he can't. And I don't think, but it's not a statement about him. It's a statement about the way that the Republican Party does not want to work together. I mean, that's like, they've really realized that by being obstructionist, they cement their base, they energize their base, and they prevent the Democrats from having any win. They've been doing this for quite a while now. I mean, they did it all during the Obama administration. And so I think that then the problem is like, so one Biden was had a better orientation than Obama in that he's recognized, okay, we don't have to have the Republicans to agree on everything in order to get some stuff done. And so he's been willing to try to make the move without being locked into bipartisanship. The problem is there are these two horrible senators who are they're called Democrats. They're basically on the right. And so they put up a barrier and pull the party back further and further to the right, blocking Biden's agenda. So again, so on this one, I think that the better way to think about it is not Biden as a person, but how the constellation of political forces, part of this late decayed, decrepit capitalism, is working. And I just want to add one thing on this. So, this kind of, I've been trying to lately theorize this is not called capitalism, but I'll just call it capitalism for right now. It's really operating through politics, through political control of wealth, through political control of absence of taxes, right? Through basically the economic historian Robert Breno calls it politically driven upward redistribution of wealth. I'll say that one more time. Politically driven upward redistribution of wealth. It's not market oriented at all, right? It's a political use of the state to redistribute wealth.
The state to control the wealth in the country.
And that is, even as we recognize, we can talk about capitalism in the state for a long time, and that's always been a place. But now it's much more the state driving how capitalism works than capitalism using market forces against the state. It's much more the fact that the wealthy have control of the state to a degree, because development's, I won't go into all the economic stuff right away because I've been talking a long time. But you see the idea. I think it's back to the Biden question. The general thing is it's the forces, the political forces, not his own capacity.
Do Democratic and Republicans represent different fractions of the USA ruling classes?
I think about that a lot, and I'm never really sure because the U.S. working classes U.S. ruling classes donate to both parties. Their lobbyists lobby both parties. So that part makes it seem like it's just both, that it's essentially two different parties with different strategies of mobilizing bases, but the capitalists trying to benefit by paying out both.
They put eggs on both sides.
Yeah, exactly. But on the other hand, it seems like it's also accurate that oil and gas interest are more likely to give to Republicans, and that technology and entertainment are more likely to give to Democrats. Finance goes both directions for sure.
And the military industrial complex.
I would I think that's a good question. I don't know. I would put them on both sides. I think that it's the Democrats like Joe Biden are huge friends of the military. They're not known at all. Biden's pretty direct and it reflects U.S. imperialist policy. I think both that it's not one or the other for military.
Professor, is the United States a democracy?
No.
How could you define the political system in the United States?
I guess I would call it right now probably an oligarchy or an authoritarian oligarchy. that would probably be maybe, or if we go in good old Leninist terms, we could just call it the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, and we can see how the elements of dictatorship are clearer and clearer than they've been in the past. So if we go in Lenin direction, dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, but all capitalist states are that. So if we try to be a little more precise and political sciencey, I'd probably say an authoritarian oligarchy.
Professor, we are finishing this interview, which has been very interesting and enlightening. And I would like to ask two questions that I always ask our guests. What book have you read or are reading during the pandemic and would like to point out to our internet users? And which series or movie could you suggest to those who are following us?
Yeah, when they told me that these are the questions, I was like, oh geez, I'm gonna seem like somebody with not great taste, and I don't have really highfalutin, I can't name some like obscure Uzbeki alternative film that no one has seen that I uncovered. So I don't have anything like that. I'm like super middle brow and mainstream in my taste. So with that kind of caveat, I've got a tiny bit of a story on this. This is the movie one. So 3 weeks ago, my partner and I were talking, and I'm like, I'm never going to the movies again. We can watch them on TV. It's too risky. Why would we bother? It's just nice to be at home. I'm not going to the movies. And then like within 2 or 3 days, a new movie was announced, Roadrunner, which is a documentary about the life of the chef and travel host Anthony Bourdain. And Anthony Bourdain, you may know, committed suicide 3 years ago. And I'm like, okay, we got to go to the movies. We've got to go see this documentary about the life of Anthony Bourdain. Roadrunner. It's wonderful. I love that. And I'll say one of the reasons also that we were very excited about it is we've been watching his TV series called Parts Unknown, which was originally on CNN. But it wasn't quite a travel show or a food show. He went to Palestine. I mean, there's a much more of a political underpinning in it. But you're interested in him and the people. So we've been watching during COVID. We were watching a lot of Anthony Bourdain's series, and Parts Unknown is one of them. So that's my TV one. And then I have the book I read that is the most is a novel, and here it is. I don't know if you can see it.
Audrey Schulman, Theory of Bastards.
Exactly, Audrey Schulman, Theory of Bastards, and this one has a story too. So. It's a novel. It's kind of dystopic future. The main character is a woman who's a scientist who has some health problems, but her science, she works with bonobos, the monkey, the chimpanzee, they eat bonobos. So there's tons of stuff about bonobos. So for like a week, anytime I was talking with my partner, all I would do is talk about bonobos because I was so engaged. But I essentially took a break from life to just read this novel. And I had spent all day reading it. And I got to, let's say, page 235, and 30 pages of the book were gone. It was a mistake. And I'm like, oh no, like there's a mistake in the binding of this book. There's a whole hunk of it is gone. It just jumps 30 pages. So I get online, I find the author's email address and the publisher, and I contact them. I'm like, I'm reading this right now. I have to have this. And I couldn't believe it. Audrey Schulman, who I've never met, I don't know her, she emails me back a PDF with the missing pages so that I could finish the book that night. So she's wonderful, and the book is wonderful, and I think everyone should read Theory of Bastards.
Thank you for your invitation. Professor Jodi Dean, thank you once again for your kindness in accepting the invitation to this conversation, which has been certainly very interesting and exciting for our internet users and especially for me.
Oh, thank you. It's been so fun. I really appreciate it.
Encerramos assim mais uma edição do programa 20 Minutos Internacional. Nossa convidada foi Jodi Dean, professora, escritora e militante política norte-americana, autora do livro Camarada, um ensaio sobre pertencimento político, recentemente lançado no Brasil pela editora Boitempo. Obrigados a todos e a todas pela audiência. Até uma próxima oportunidade. Um grande abraço. Para assistir novamente esse programa e a outras edições dos programas 20 Minutos, se inscreva no canal do Opera Mundi no YouTube. Curta e compartilhe nossos vídeos. Deixe seus comentários. O jornalismo de Opera Mundi é mantido com o seu apoio. Faça uma assinatura solidária em www.operamundi.com.br. Com um pequeno valor mensal, você nos ajuda no desenvolvimento de um jornalismo independente e de qualidade. Obrigado pela audiência e até a próxima.